Hello my friends, and welcome back to another Baldur's Gate 3 tier listing guide. Hope you're all doing well. Today, in my ongoing series covering Baldur's Gate itemization, we're talking about gloves. Specifically, Act 2 gloves. In part 1 of this video, we covered all of the gloves in Act 1, how powerful they are and which characters they're good for, whether you should pick them up at all or leave them behind, and in part 2 we're going to cover all the gloves in Act 2. There's kind of a fun irony to this video, because since it's the middle part of a 3-part series, I expect it to get the least views of the gloves videos, but this is actually probably the most important, so if you're watching this one, you should know that you're very smart. The reason for this is that itemization decisions are most impactful in general in Act 2. In Act 1, you often don't have a lot of choices, so you're just making the best of what you have available, and aren't making a lot of complicated decisions. And by Act 3, your party is so powerful that the impact of individual items has been reduced drastically because the overall power level of your party is so high. Act 2 is where items really shine, and making sure that you have the best ones is going to be the most important for your success or failure. And since gloves are the most impactful item slot in general, I think, this is perhaps the most important video in this entire series. I've already covered the definitions of the tiers and how we're rating the items in part 1, so let's just get right into it and start with the Brandrain Gloves. The Brandrain Gloves give you, whenever you inflict psychic damage, you also inflict 2 turns of mental fatigue. Mental fatigue is a condition that gives enemies -1 to their mental saving throws, so intelligence, wisdom, and charisma, per turn remaining, so when you hit an enemy with psychic damage the first time, they take a -2 penalty to their mental saves. When you hit them again, they have a -4 penalty. If they fail a save while they have 5 or more stacks, they lose the effect, so you can't just stack this indefinitely, but basically this reads, attack an enemy a couple times, and your next spell targeting one of those saves is guaranteed to hit. It's kind of a poor man's arcane acuity if you can do psychic damage regularly. Luckily, in the game, there is an extremely easy way to do psychic damage regularly, which is to take the Illithid power that allows you to do psychic damage with all of your attacks. When you have this on, for example, a Swords Bard, you can use the Brandrain Gloves to stack mental acuity with your physical attacks, and then cast something like Hold Person, targeting their wisdom saves, effectively guaranteeing that enemies fail the save. This is still worse than Arcane Acuity, because rather than giving you a bonus to all of your spells, it only works against the thing you actually hit with psychic damage. So you can't attack one character and then cast a spell on a different character with the saving throw bonus, like you can with Arcane Acuity, but it's still an extremely powerful effect to reduce enemy saving throws and be able to land your spells more easily. Most of the time, characters that can easily take advantage of this, like say a Swords Bard or Blade Warlock or something along those lines, will have other gloves that they prefer more, like the Daredevil Gloves, Dexterity Gloves, Gloves of Archery, and so on. But for characters that maybe don't have great access to Arcane Acuity stacking and still want to land Hold Person and have Illithid powers, the Brandrain Gloves are actually an interesting item. I'm going to put them in B tier because this is a powerful effect, and if you're playing a run where like Arcane Acuity is banned, for example, then the Brandrain Gloves can definitely do a solid impression of an Arcane Acuity item, but in general for this effect you're going to have more powerful options available. The Cindersnap Gloves. The Cindersnap Gloves have no passive effect when worn, but let you, once per short rest, cast Protection from Missiles. Protection from Missiles is a concentration spell that makes arrow attacks, ranged weapon attacks against you, have disadvantage and do half damage, so basically makes you immune to archers for the 10-turn duration of the spell. Once per short rest, that's not bad. The character who's wearing these will be completely immune to archery, more or less, and so if you have a character who is getting just obliterated by ranged attackers in every combat, the Cindersnap Gloves could reasonably patch that problem. Now, typically, you're going to want to avoid having that problem in the first place by engaging or taking out archers before they actually get to shoot, or by having your characters have high enough AC that you don't need this effect. But if it's happening to you, this is definitely a band-aid that you can put over that problem. And it comes early enough in the game that there are still a lot of fights. So unlike the other source of protection from missiles, the Cindersnap Gloves will come early enough in the game that you will get a lot of use out of these. Do I recommend using these? No, not really. This is a purely defensive option, and typically, especially in the glove slot, you're going to be better off with things that buff your offense than your defense. But the Cindersnap Gloves are a reasonably powerful effect for a character that really needs them. I'm going to put them in C tier, but I will say that these are one to keep an eye on for if you are having one character specifically just get pincushioned over and over again, and you can definitely swap them in for combats with a lot of archers. There's also a couple things that you can do with the Cindersnap Gloves. In particular, for example, if you have a powerful archer in your party and you're doing the mirror fight, then you can use the Cindersnap Gloves to make one character immune to that character's attacks. Overall, though, in general, you're going to be better off with more offensively oriented gloves, but these at least do have some things going for them. The Dark Justiciar Gauntlets. The DJ Gauntlets, which is what I'm going to call them, just to speed things up, give you +1 to your strength saving throws, which of course we can ignore just like we can for most of the other gloves that give that effect, and also 1d4 necrotic damage on every one of your weapon attacks. DJ Gauntlet is also, of course, my other alter ego as a Scandinavian pop-punk artist. +1d4 necrotic damage on all of your weapon attacks is obviously excellent. Any character that's making weapon attacks can benefit from this, and while it doesn't sound like a significant bonus, 1d4 is only 2.5 on average, remember that this applies to every weapon attack you make, so it gets multiplied if you're making more than one weapon attack in a round. And because it's rolling a die, it gets doubled on a critical hit. So if you are critically hitting, and if you're making a lot of weapon attacks in a round to maximize the effect of this item, you are probably critically hitting pretty frequently. If you have bonuses to your crit chance or advantage, you crit more often. The amount of damage that you get from this item actually ends up being quite significant on average. It's also worth noting that on difficulty levels below Honor Mode, these Damage Rider items often come with bugs, which let you get way more damage than you're supposed to out of them, because sometimes they will trigger multiple times when you have things that add damage to your attacks, like Tavern Brawler will trigger this over again, or the Tavern Brawler bonus damage will trigger off the D4 in addition to your normal damage, that kind of thing. Obviously not for this one, because it's a weapon attack, but you can often end up with way more damage than is intended from these bonus damage items because of the Damage Rider bugs that they didn't fix until they released Honor Mode. The DJ Gauntlets are obviously an incredibly powerful item for any character that makes weapon attacks. There's only two things holding them back, though. One is that they do necrotic damage, which is one of the worst types of damage to do in Baldur's Gate, because, especially in Act 2, because so many enemies are resistant or immune to it. And the second is that you get them later on in Act 2, so it's possible that you already have a set of gauntlets that gives you this effect already, the Flawed Helldusk Gloves, depending on exactly what route you take through the game. Nevertheless, the likelihood that your party has two characters that want to do bonus damage on weapon attacks is pretty high. So the Dark Justiciar Gauntlets are quite possible to make their way into your party, even if you already have this effect on another item, like the Flawed Helldusk Gloves. And of course, there's a lot of routes you can take through the game where you don't get access to the Flawed Helldusk Gloves at all, or not yet. So the Dark Justiciar Gauntlets are just going to be excellent. Increasing your damage on weapon attacks is exactly what we want the glove slot to do. This is kind of the highest calling for this weapon slot, or for this item slot, because this is the offensive item slot, so doing more damage is exactly what we want from it. S tier. The rare DJ Gauntlets. These are an upgraded version of the Dark Justiciar Gauntlets that you get for making a certain story choice, and they do effectively the identical thing, giving you plus 1d4 to your necrotic damage to your weapon attacks, and an additional 1 to your strength save, but they also let you cast the Beckoning Darkness spell at will, or rather once per turn. As a bonus action, you can cause an enemy to make a DC 14 charisma save, or they take 2d8 necrotic damage if they enter or start their turn in darkness. They'll take the damage immediately if you cast this on them when they're already in darkness. So basically this is a bonus action for a relatively low save DC, but a decent amount of additional damage. 2d8 necrotic damage as a bonus action is not at all embarrassing. And you might even get more than that if the enemy then continues to stand in a darkened area. This works for any obscured or lightly obscured area, so it's going to go off basically all over the place. And, of course, this is free in addition to what's already a very powerful effect from the normal Dark Justiciar gauntlets. So, obviously, these are going to be S tier because they're an upgraded version of an S tier item that you get more or less around the same time. And the Beckoning Darkness effect, in addition to being completely free on top of a very good item, is actually pretty powerful for just doing a little bit of additional damage. Bonus actions to do damage are always good, so getting that on these gloves is going to be pretty solid. Even if enemies pass their saving throw, which will happen less often than you might think, because it targets charisma, and a lot of enemies have very low charisma, then it's still effectively free, because it just costs you your bonus action and doesn't have a cooldown, so you can use this any turn you don't have a good use for your bonus action. Very powerful item and very powerful option. S tier. The Flawed Helldusk Gloves. The Flawed Helldusk Gloves are available early in Act 2 and give you an additional d4 fire damage on your weapon attacks and an additional d4 necrotic damage on your unarmed attacks. They also have a DC 13 con save or on the unarmed attacks or enemies suffer from bleeding. That DC 13 con save is hidden. It won't show up in the combat log, and it won't trigger things like cutting words or portent dice, because the enemies just roll it secretly. But it is a DC 13 con save, so it will go off sometimes, but not maybe as often as you would like. But if you're hitting an enemy a bunch of times in a turn, they have to make the save several times a turn, and they will probably end up bleeding. The bleeding obviously isn't the important part of this item. It's the fact that it does an additional d4 damage on your weapon attacks or an additional d4 damage on your unarmed attacks, and obviously is great for that reason. It is a rare party that cannot make use of the Flawed Helldusk Gloves when you get access to it, and just like I said for the Dark Justiciar gauntlets, most parties are going to be very happy to have 2 copies of this effect. So even though the Dark Justiciar gauntlets and the Flawed Helldusk Gloves both exist, I'm still going to put them both in S tier because increasing your weapon damage is just so incredibly powerful. One fun thing to note for this weapon, if you throw a weapon, it counts you as both using a weapon and unarmed, so you get the fire damage from the weapon usage and the unarmed, the bleeding potential from the unarmed version of the attack. It also works on things that count as unarmed attacks that aren't actual attacks, like the Elk Barbarian Charge, and you can see an entire build that I created around that to abuse that effect with knocking enemies prone and maiming them to prevent them from ever taking actions. So there's a lot of broken builds with the Flawed Helldusk Gloves as well, but overall this is just great stats for the slot and S tier item. The Gauntlets of Surging Accuracy. So these are actually only the second set of gloves we've looked at that require medium armor proficiency, in addition to just the normal metallic gloves. Though weirdly, they don't give you the +1 to strength saves that most of the gloves that seem like they are a little heavier give you in this game. The Gauntlets of Surging Accuracy give you, whenever you use Action Surge, the level 2 fighter ability Action Surge, you gain a +1d4 bonus to your hit chance on all of your weapon attacks that round. It's worth mentioning, this might seem obvious, but it's worth mentioning that you can Action Surge before taking your action, so you can use this bonus both on your normal action and on your Action Surge action, as well as on any like haste attacks or bloodlust attacks and whatever that you happen to get that round. So you can get +1d4 to your attacks on a lot of attacks if you use this item appropriately. Your Action Surge turns are likely to be your most important turns as a fighter, because you wouldn't be using Action Surge if it wasn't important for you to do something. So this gives you a pretty solid bonus on the turns in a combat that are going to be most important. The main downside of this item is that it is something that only works once per short rest, because 1 turn per short rest, because that's how Action Surge works. And honestly, on your Action Surge turns, you don't really need the help. You're already spending a resource to do something really, really powerful. You don't really need to make those turns better. I would typically prefer to have my effectiveness increased every turn. And it's also not clear always, because you often have other sources of increased hit chance, that this is better than just increasing our damage output with one of the gloves that increases our weapon damage. There are definitely builds that can make use of the Gauntlets of Surging Accuracy, and accuracy bonuses are of course very powerful, but I would prefer to get those from precision attack, from bless, from having advantage in general, than equipping an item that's only going to be used one turn per short rest. Not that the Gauntlets of Surging Accuracy are bad, and they will definitely improve your Action Surge turns, but overall I think they're a little bit overshadowed by other options. I'm going to put them in B tier, because if you have a character that is struggling to hit things and has Action Surge, this can be a great way to offset that. But for the most part, I think you're going to be better off just equipping items that increase your damage instead. The Gloves of the Automaton. The Gloves of the Automaton let you turn yourself into a robot once per short rest for 10 turns. While you're in automaton form, you have advantage on your attack rolls and resistance to lightning damage. Just passive advantage on attack rolls for 10 turns. Once per short rest, it's cast as a bonus action, so you can use it after you enter combat. In this form, you also, because you're a construct, can't use many forms of healing. Most healing spells won't work on you, but you can still use potions or have potions thrown at you, so you can still heal in a lot of ways if you happen to get knocked out of, if you happen to, like, really badly need a heal, you still do have options, and for the most part, that's not a significant downside for this item anyways. Once per short rest, just gaining advantage on all of your attacks for 10 turns is obviously great. And this has no condition at all. You just have advantage on all of your weapon attacks. So as long as you're making attacks with a weapon, you have advantage when you have the Gloves of the Automaton. These are going to let you hit your attacks much more easily. On any character that doesn't have a natural source of advantage, these are amazing. You can pre-cast them before you enter combat, or because it's a bonus action, you can cast them during combat if you just need advantage, and don't have another use for a bonus action. Advantage is good, and the Gloves of the Automaton give it to you effectively, permanently, for free, so I'm going to put them in S tier. I think that basically, the choice is going to be between additional damage from these three items or advantage from the Gloves of the Automaton for basically any character using weapon attacks. It's also worth mentioning that these gloves are bugged, and the effect does remain if you cast it and then take them off, so you can precast it before combat, gain 10 turns of advantage on all your attacks, and then swap to a different set of gloves, for example the Flawed Helldusk Gloves, to get the best of both worlds. Even without abusing that or exploiting that, though, the Gloves of the Automaton are still just excellent. The Gloves of Battlemage's Power. These gloves give you, whenever a weapon attack inflicts a condition on an enemy, you gain Arcane Acuity. So if you are, for example, an Eldritch Knight who attacks and inflicts a condition on every attack, or if you have, like, Radiating Orbs or Reverberation, then you gain Arcane Acuity every time you attack. Except you don't, because these items are bugged currently and do literally nothing. Well, I guess they give you +1 to your strength saves, but the Gloves of Battlemage's Power don't work. They don't give you the Arcane Acuity currently, so at time of recording, these are D tier. If they actually worked, Arcane Acuity is incredibly strong. You would obviously have to be a specific character to make use of them, so I would probably put them in A tier, but as of right now, since they don't function, D tier. The Gloves of Crushing. The Gloves of Crushing give you a +1 to your attack rolls, and +2 to damage with your unarmed attacks. By the time you get these gloves, this is a reasonably powerful effect. It's similar to the Sparkle Hands. I think it averages out to slightly less damage on average than the Sparkle Hands when you do the math. But the Gloves of Crushing overall give you a reasonably powerful effect. But by the time you get them, you have so many options for monk gloves that you're unlikely, I think, to want the Gloves of Crushing. You have the Cinder and Sizzle gloves for damage, you have the Sparkle Hands for attack bonuses and damage, you have the Flawed Helldusk gloves for alternate damage if you have multiple characters making unarmed attacks. So it would have to be a pretty unusual party to want the Gloves of Crushing in addition to all of those very slightly better options. Since these just give you a raw stat bonus, and that stat bonus is slightly lower than the other stat bonuses you're getting from equivalent items, I'm going to put them in C tier. Maybe for an all-monk party, this could come up. But given the sheer variety and power level of the other options for monk gloves at this point, the Gloves of Crushing, I think, are rarely going to see play. The Gloves of the Balanced Hands. These give you the two-weapon fighting style when you have them worn. It's the same as you get from taking levels of Fighter or Ranger or Swordsbard, and lets you add your ability modifier to your damage on your offhand attacks. So if you're dual wielding, normally, let's say you're firing two-hand crossbows, normally you don't get to add your dexterity to damage on your offhand attack. When you're wearing these, you do, so it's going to increase your damage output significantly. For characters making multiple offhand attacks per turn, if they have levels in Thief Rogue, for example, this is actually a better increase to your damage output, even than the gloves that increase your damage, like the DJ Gauntlets and the Flawed Helldusk gloves, because you get to add your entire dexterity modifier to all of these offhand attacks. So it's going to usually be more damage on average, even than those, which are already very good. Now, normally characters who are set up this way are going to get this from multiclassing. One level of Fighter can get you the two-weapon fighting style, Ranger gets it, Swordsbard gets it, so often the Gloves of the Balanced Hands will be redundant with already having the fighting style. But if you're playing, for example, a monoclass rogue, the Gloves of the Balanced Hands are actually going to be best in slot for increasing your damage. So while that's not the typical way to play rogue, or sort of the most optimal way for honor mode to play rogue, you're usually going to want to multiclass it. That is still a totally reasonable build, and one that a lot of players are interested in playing. And so I'm going to put the Gloves of the Balanced Hands in A tier especially for thief rogues, who are firing with offhand weapons and staying monoclassed. A tier seems perfect here because it's best in slot for a slightly niche character. The Gloves of the Duelist. The Gloves of the Duelist give you +2 to your attacks with melee weapons, so +2 to hit with melee weapons if you're using a one-handed weapon. The tooltip actually says that you need to have your offhand be empty, but that's actually not true. You just need to not have a weapon in your offhand or be using a two-handed weapon. You can still benefit from this with a shield. So a character who has an empty offhand or a character who's using a sword and board style one-handed weapon and shield can use these to gain +2 to their attack rolls with the Gloves of the Duelist. This will also work with throwing weapons, just like the dueling gloves, or just like the duelist fighting style. So you can add +2 to your attack rolls and +2 to your damage if you are a sword and board setup character with the dueling fighting style and the Gloves of the Duelist. +2 to your attack rolls is pretty nice. Obviously, hit chance is good, but it's significantly worse overall than the Gloves of the Automaton, unless you have easy sources of advantage from other items. So most of the time, I think that the Gloves of the Duelist are not going to come up. And for the characters that do want to come up, it's not clear to me that they're actually better than the Gloves of the Growling Underdog, because those are the types of characters that will tend to be surrounded by enemies the most, if you're like a sword and board paladin, for example. And for those characters, again, having advantage on their attacks from the Gloves of the Growling Underdog may be better than the +2 to hit from the Gloves of the Duelist. Since these are outdone by the Gloves of the Automaton, for most characters, they are not going to be S tier. And I think that they are typically going to either be superseded by increases to your damage or sources of advantage. So the Gloves of the Duelist, unfortunately, despite being a cool passive benefit for a type of character that doesn't actually get a lot of support in Baldur's Gate 3, the more generically powerful items are, generally speaking, going to just be better. I will still put them in B tier, because +2 to your hit chance is still good, and so there are characters that can get some use out of these, but for the most part you're going to be better off with the Gloves of the Automaton, or other more powerful options for increasing your damage output. The Ichorous Gloves. The Ichorous Gloves give you Whenever you deal acid damage to an enemy, you also have a chance to inflict noxious fumes on them. They have to make a DC 13 dex save or they get noxious fumes. Noxious fumes deals 1d4 acid damage to all hostile creatures in a 10-foot radius. So basically enemies have to make a DC 13 dex save or they start damaging themselves and their allies every turn for 3 turns in a 10-foot radius. This is such a tiny increase to your damage output and relies on using a damage type that most characters don't have easy access to. Doing regular acid damage is actually somewhat difficult. So the Ichorous Gloves typically will not be easy to trigger. If you do trigger them, enemies will make the saving throw, because it's a DC 13 dex save, which is sort of free for most enemies to pass, and even if they fail the saving throw, it's not a particularly powerful effect. So, D tier for the Ichorous Gloves. It's just a lot of work to set up something that doesn't even really do anything. The Hroknir Bracers. So firstly, these were clearly named in an attempt to persecute me personally, because I have to try to work out how this is pronounced in order to make this tier list. Maybe it's Hroknir, I'm not entirely sure. But anyways, the Hroknir Bracers give you the ability to cast Mage Hand as a bonus action, Quickened Mage Hand, if you have Mage Hand already, which is actually pretty nice. Mage Hand in combat is not terrible, and you can use it to like absorb an enemy attack by bonus action casting it next to them, so it kind of gives you the ability to absorb an enemy attack as a bonus action once per short rest, which isn't in and of itself a terrible thing, and of course Mage Hand is a reasonably powerful ability. By itself that wouldn't be very good, but it also gives you Telekinesis castable once per short rest. Telekinesis is a level 5 spell, and while it's not the most powerful spell when you have to spend spell slots on it, a level 5 spell once per short rest without having to spend spell slots is pretty incredible. Even though you don't get these till fairly late in Act 2, the Hroknir Bracers give you an extremely powerful effect multiple times per day, and are going to let any character that has a decent item save DC cast a pretty powerful spell without spending any resources. Telekinesis can be used for all kinds of cool tricks, in addition to just like the normal damage that it does. You can throw enemies off cliffs, you can throw things into one another, you can throw Guardians of Faith or Summons at your enemies, you can throw Karlach at a bunch of enemies. So the Hroknir Bracers actually give you a lot of options and let you use one of the cooler effects in the game much more regularly than you could otherwise, because normally telekinesis is very expensive, but not when you get it for free. For that reason, I'm going to put it in A tier. I don't think that these are something that you'd necessarily want to build your whole strategy around, and not every party is going to want to use them, but it's a very powerful effect. And of course, you can use them, swap them out for another item if you aren't going to short rest to refresh it. But since they happen every short rest, this is an option to just swap in for any fight where you think telekinesis is going to be good. So I would definitely hang on to these, because the Hroknir Bracers have a ton of uses and also give you a lot of creative options for solving out of combat encounters where you wouldn't want to spend a level 5 spell slot, but since you have telekinesis for free, you can just use it to get your whole party up to a ledge or pull stuff out from behind walls or whatever. Awesome item. Really love that this makes a more situational spell much more usable. A tier for the Hroknir Bracers. The Jhannyl Gloves. The Jhannyl Gloves give you +1 to your saving throws, and once per long rest, when you're blinded, poisoned, or paralyzed, you automatically cast Lesser Restoration on yourself. This doesn't take your turn or anything, so it just immediately removes the effect when you get hit by it, by casting Lesser Restoration on yourself. That by itself is not very good. You typically shouldn't plan for your characters to get hit by debilitating effects, and you wouldn't in general want to have your character only recover from that once per long rest. You'd rather just give them immunity through the various means where you can become immune to that effect. +1 to your saves, of course, is a pretty solid effect. Increasing your saving throws is always good and makes it less likely that you're going to get hit by the debilitating effects. But for the most part, these gloves just don't do enough to justify wearing them in a very important glove slot. There's one use for them, which is on a character that is already sort of immune to physical damage, like, for example, the Barbarian Dodge Tank build that I posted, or the Abjuration Wizard build that I posted. The Jhannyl's Gloves can make those characters immune to the only thing that can sort of take them out, which is things like Paralyzed. And so you could maybe swap them in for a fight where you're worried about those effects landing on your characters that are otherwise more or less immune to damage. You could maybe use these in a solo run to avoid getting hit by something that just ends your run immediately, like a hold person. But for the most part, the Jhannyl's Gloves are just not going to be significantly impactful for your character. +1 to your saving throws, though, is worth considering for characters that are struggling with that. I'm going to put them in C tier because I really don't think you should spend your glove slot defensively like this typically, but for a character that really needs to improve their saving throws, and that's the only thing that they need from their items, the Jhannyl's Gloves do let you do that with a slot that otherwise normally doesn't. The Luminous Gloves. The Luminous Gloves give you +1 to your strength saves, and also, whenever you do radiant damage, you apply 2 turns of Radiating Orb. Radiating Orb reduces enemy attack rolls by 1 per turn remaining, stacks up to 10. There's a lot of ways to gain Radiating Orb stacking, like the Luminous Armour, so obviously you're going to combine this with sources of radiant damage, like Spirit Guardians, and other things that provide Radiating Orb to stack enemies to really high numbers so that they can never hit their attacks. This says Radiating Orb on it, so you know that this item is going to be broken. It was inexplicably buffed. It used to only apply 1 stack of Radiating Orb, and now it applies 2, which makes it very, very easy with this item and one other item that applies Radiating Orb to get to 10 stacks. If you just do 2 instances of radiant damage in a turn, you can easily hit 8 to 10 stacks of Radiating Orb, which turns off physical attacks for that enemy permanently. You can do this in an AoE with AoE radiant damage like Spirit Guardians. Obviously, we've all heard me talk about how broken Radiating Orb effects are for ad nauseum, so I don't need to go into it again. The Luminous Gloves, of course, are S tier for any character who's doing Radiating Orb stacking. The Poisoner's Gloves. The Poisoner's Gloves are, I mentioned them in my Cloaks tier list. They give you, whenever you deal poison damage, the enemy has to make a DC 13 Constitution save, or they become poisoned, getting the poisoned effect. The gimmick here is that you combine these with the Poisoner's set of items, so you use them with the Derivation Cloak and the Broodmother's Revenge to give yourself, whenever you attack, enemies have to save against poison, take some poison damage, and you heal, because all of those items combine, so that whenever you heal, your next attack does poison damage. Whenever you poison an enemy, whenever you hit an enemy with poison damage, they have to save or they become poisoned, and whenever they get poisoned, you heal. So all of those together let you sort of loop those effects for a little bit of extra poison damage, poisoning enemies, and a little bit of healing every turn. Unfortunately, this is a lot of work and a lot of gear slots to dedicate to a not very useful combination. If that item set appeared like early in Act 1, it would actually be pretty cool, but since it appears in Act 2, and also a lot of enemies are immune to poison in Act 2, the Poisoner's Gloves, unfortunately, are just not going to fit. This is a viable build, and you can build around these items, combining them together, so I will give it C tier, but this is a pretty begrudging C tier for a situational and mediocre effect that requires a bunch of other items to work. The Raven Gloves. The Raven Gloves let you, once per short rest, cast Find Familiar to summon Quoth the Raven. Obviously, great reference, very funny name for a raven, of course. I think reference to Terry Pratchett, who, of course, himself was referencing Edgar Allan Poe. But Summon Quoth the Raven is basically just Find Familiar for a raven once per short rest. You can get this from the Find Familiar spell, which is a first level spell, and you can't use it in combination with any other form of the Find Familiar spell, so if you have the unique familiar or other sources of more powerful familiars, you can't use this. The Raven Familiar is probably the best familiar, so it at least doesn't lock you into using a bad familiar, but Find Familiar once per short rest from an item, an important item slot is really not great, and the Quoth does disappear if you unequip the gloves, so you can't just cast them and then swap them out. So the Raven Gloves, unfortunately, give you a very low-level spell and eat a very important slot, so you're never going to want these D tier. The Swordmaster Gloves. The Swordmaster Gloves give you proficiency with short swords, long swords, and great swords, so you just get sword proficiency. Not other melee weapons, only swords, though swords tend to be the best weapons in the game, so you will typically have access to all the weapons that you need, and you gain a +1 bonus to your melee attack rolls. This item does not seem to do enough to me. Most characters that want to make weapon attacks are already going to have the sword proficiencies, so you could maybe use this for a character that doesn't have martial weapon proficiency and nevertheless wants to use a greatsword, but for the most part you'll already have the proficiencies, and there's no character that wants +1 to attack rolls when they could have one of the much better sources of accuracy available from gloves. Obviously, these don't hold a candle to the Automaton Gloves, or even to the Growling Underdog Gloves or the Duelist Gloves, and of course, most characters are going to prefer damage to the accuracy bonus anyways, if you've built your character appropriately to have a decent hit chance and have other hit chance increases. The Swordmaster Gloves overall I just don't think are going to come up. I am again going to give them C tier, because I think there could be a character that really needed the greatsword proficiency, and could use the Swordmaster Gloves. I haven't seen a build like that myself, but it's one to maybe think about. But the Swordmaster Gloves overall are just a worse bonus than other items that do effectively the same thing. And finally, for the Act 2 gloves, the Thermoarcanic Gloves. The Thermoarcanic Gloves give you, whenever you deal fire damage, you gain 2 turns of heat. This can stack multiple times in a turn, so you can gain a lot of heat really quickly if you're dealing multiple instances of fire damage, like with Scorching Ray, for example. You can stack heat up really high. And heat basically does 1d4 fire damage to you per turn while you have any stacks of it. And you can spend all of those stacks to deal 1 additional fire damage per stack on your next attack that does fire damage. So basically you can use like a Scorching Ray to build up a bunch of heat, and then spend it all on a fireball to do a bunch of extra damage with that fireball. When you spend the heat on an attack that does multiple instances of damage, like Scorching Ray, it only works on the first one, but if you spend it on an AoE spell, it'll hit everything. So typically the play pattern is going to be to build up a bunch of heat and then use it on an AoE spell to do more damage with that AoE spell. In general, I think this just isn't really worth the effort. The types of characters that are going to be building up heat stacks easily will often have just killed all the enemies by the time they're ready to discharge the heat stacks. And even in sort of the best case scenario, where you discharge 7, the maximum heat stacks, on a fireball hitting a bunch of enemies, that's a lot of extra damage, but you've had to stack that up ahead of time in order to generate that. Maybe you'd have been better off killing some of those enemies earlier on just by casting the fireball right away. So the Thermoarcanic Gloves, I think, are a little bit of a solution in search of a problem. They boost your AoE damage later in the fight, which is not when you need AoE damage. They can be a nice boost for fire damage characters that are just sort of passively doing fire damage. So if you are using just the Flawed Helldusk Gloves on your attack, then building up heat could be good, but those are the same item slot. So the Thermoarcanic Gloves cannot work with the Flawed Helldusk Gloves that imbue fire. If you have a weapon that does fire damage, then using additional heat stacks can be good, but it's still going to be less damage than just adding more damage with, like, the Dark Justiciar Gauntlets to your weapon attacks. So overall, I think that the Thermoarcanic Gloves are typically not going to be incredible. For a fire sorcerer that's building up stacks really quickly because it's casting Scorching Ray and then wants to fireball big groups of enemies, they can be reasonable. But for the most part, I think you're just going to have better options for those characters regardless. So I'm going to put them in C tier because there are some characters who can get some use out of them, but mostly these are, like I said, a solution in search of a problem, because boosting your AoE damage late in the fight just isn't something that you usually want to spend effort on. It's also worth noting that the 1d4 damage per turn is Not a big deal, but not totally irrelevant for spellcasters who make the best use of these items, because it might break your concentration. Even 1d4 damage is another concentration roll you have to roll, and that's another 1 in 20 chance of getting a natural 1 and losing concentration on an important spell. So overall, the Thermoarcanic Gloves, I think, for some very niche builds can be interesting, but most of the time are just not worth it, the pretty significant investment in item slot, play pattern, and general loss of utility that you have to add to your character in order to make use of them. Alright, my friends, I hope that you've enjoyed this look at all of the gloves in Act 2, and hopefully this will help you gear your characters for the most important parts of the game. The real takeaway here is that this is when the gloves really start to take off. Characters, especially for characters that are making weapon attacks. Characters who are attacking enemies get permanent advantage if they want it. They get a whole bunch of extra damage output if they want it. Many of them will, of course, still be wearing some of the S tier Act 1 gloves, but Act 2 gives us significant upgrades for damage dealers, which are both the most important upgrades to get, because damage dealers tend to be the most item-dependent characters, and also some of the most impactful, because killing enemies before they go is one of the best things that you can do in Baldur's Gate 3 strategically. The Gloves of the Automaton and the various gloves that increase your weapon damage obviously make that vastly easier, and of course the Luminous Gloves are just part of one of the most broken strategies in the game, so those should slot pretty nicely into any party. Act 2 also gives you a bunch of cool alternative options for various types of characters, like the Hroknir Bracers, and the Gloves of the Balanced Hands, Gloves of the Duelist, and so on. So even if you don't want to just gear your party in, like, passive damage boosts, which admittedly are slightly boring, there are still some really cool options in Act 2. As always, if you think that I have missed something about one of these items and should move things around, please do let me know in the comments. I am very open to changing things. I'm recording this before I've posted Act 1, so I haven't seen your feedback yet, but we will update these in a future video if you have good arguments as to why some things should move around. And, of course, as always, my friends, hope that you've enjoyed the tier list. And if you have, hit like, leave a comment, helps me out with the algorithm. And of course you can subscribe to my channel for more Baldur's Gate 3 tier lists and other strategy game analysis. Cheers, my friends, and I'll catch you next time with the Act 3 gloves.